Well, Josh, I want to start off by saying thank you because me forcing you to read my books and then interview me about the books, which I will then take this video and force my friends to watch, is like peak indie author energy right there. Like,
There was no forcing involved. I happily read them. They were great. I finished the third one. I want to say like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. I mean, it's been a while since I
yeah.
got done with it. So
Well, before you start asking me questions, I'm going to start by asking you a question.
okay.
Is it weird reading your friend's work? Like, is it one of those things where you have to sort of like forget that you know the person who wrote it?
All right. So I read your last novella series,
Yeah.
where Chainmail to the Apocalypse. And I feel like in that one, and maybe because it was set in Dallas, I was more acutely aware of you as the voice of it. So I think with that one, there
Yeah.
was a little bit of dissonance with that, right? Um, the current series, I think with the first book, I was more aware of it, and then each subsequent book, less and less so. So that by the third one, it was just like I was reading a book by just anyone.
Yeah.
I don't know if that sounds good to you or not, but to me, it's like
No.
I got done and I was like, oh, this was David's book, but it just felt like reading a fantasy novel. So
Well, yeah, I was wondering about that because I really struggle when I have friends that want me to read something that they've written. And
right.
only a handful of, I'm a really, as funny as it sounds, I'm a great reader, except when someone's asking me to read something. And then usually it has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with the genre that they're writing in.
Oh, really? Okay, so it's not the like I don't know. I guess personally, I would almost think it becomes mandatory versus you're just doing it anyway. I
Yeah.
guess like there's a burden placed on you.
Yeah.
Uh, but for you, it's the genre. What do you mean by that?
Well, like I've got a friend, a guy named Jarrett, who writes under the pen name Sam Renner, and he does this
Hmm.
series called Galaxy Run, and he does another one called Zulu Station, and it's just like straight up space opera.
Oh, okay.
And I just really enjoy it. And I would say almost by the fifth page, I just forgot that Jarrett was even part of it, and I was just enjoying sort of the pulp space opera science fictiony part of it. But when it's something that I wouldn't normally read, I just become acutely aware of the attempt.
Hmm.
Whereas I
Okay.
don't know, something about the genre of fiction, which I tend towards, and I know you read a lot of fantasy. There's something about that that just kind of cues me in, and I would agree with you about Wear Chainmail. This is going to sound weird, but Wear Chainmail I think was more my voice,
Okay. No, I can see that. Yeah.
whereas I feel like Dryad's Crown is more voice neutral. And
Okay.
I actually think for me that's better. I know that like in the world of writing, people tell you that you have to find your voice and that your voice is always the most important thing. But I think sometimes my voice can become a little bit of a crutch. And sometimes I just want to tell a good story. And it doesn't really, yeah, I'm just injecting myself a little too much into it, which I liked my first book, but I think that what I'm writing now I prefer just because I don't feel like I have to song and dance my way through it.
Well, so I guess like a question that's been at the back of my brain as I've been reading all of your books. I read Wear Chainmail, and then as soon as Dryad's Crown 1 came out, I jumped into that. And I felt like tonally and stylistically, it was not that much of a shift, even though the genre, the time frame, even like just the basics of the story were very different. But as I have read like book 2 and 3, they feel to me as the reader more and more less your voice. Is that intentional, or has that just come organically as you've been working on them, or am I completely wrong about this?
I don't think you're wrong about that. It reminds me of when I worked in comics.
Mm,
Because I was doing indie comics, I was working with a lot of artists who were also brand new. And what would happen is if you were working on a big project, you would actually see them growing as an artist, so that the first few pages of the comic were actually not nearly as good as the last few pages. Like by the third issue,
Yeah.
they just nailed it. And then you look back at those first pages and you're like, there's too much going on there. It's too, like, you could just tell that it just didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen is once I finish this entire series of 9 books, there's going to be a real impulse for me to want to go back to that first book and just like poke at it a bit. Because
Now, will you fight that impulse, or will you go ahead and do it, you think?
I don't know. Yeah, it sounds a little bit like George Lucas, like you're going back and although
God, don't make her shoot first, man. Come on, let's avoid that.
but I think part of it also is it's different to go back to something like right after you wrote it. It's another thing to come back to it like 2 decades later.
Right.
But I think that, like, and as I said, I really like the first book of Dryad's Crown. I'm very comfortable sending it off for reviews, and if people like it, they do. If they don't, they don't. But it is one of those things where, you know, to kind of quote Tolkien, I think it was the tale grows in the telling.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's been happening because no matter how much you outline and no matter how much you think out the characters and the world and the setting, it's always going to take a few surprise turns that are then going to make you look back at that first book and go, "Oh gosh, that's we've this is not like how it was."
All right. So book 4 is about to come out. Plug.
Yeah.
Well, how far off of your original outline had you deviated with that? The tale is the telling, or the telling is the tale. Um,
Um, the big points are sort of staying the same.
okay.
Um, book 4 leads into this big battle that I've been kind of hinting at for a while in Aberton. And then book 5 is sort of the full blown out battle. Book 4 is kind of the taste of it. The areas where it changes a little bit as you're writing it is I'll be working on the story, and Gideon, the daughter, is trying to get to Austria because she's just trying to find some place that's safe. And
Yeah.
that wasn't something that I knew that it needed to happen, but I was like, okay, she'll get there and I'll write about it. But as I'm writing about it, I'm finding that that story is more interesting than I originally thought. I go,
Oh,
and I,
okay.
and I say, oh, wow, she's going back to Penderin. That's where her father was murdered. I need to write about that a little bit. And oh, she's going to go back to the temple and she's going to meet Timon, who she's never met before, but she knows about him through her mom. And she's going to see him with different eyes than how her mom saw him. And
Okay.
things have happened in Penderin that have kind of changed it. And then you get into these weird moments where, like, they meet a family of brewers who work at a granary. And I start doing this research on how granaries operate in the medieval ages.
oh,
And
oh, my heart. It's so big right now. Go on. I'm sorry.
And then all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, the dragon would make a really good ratter, and then you're all of a sudden writing
Oh,
about that. And then what you find is you're like, wow, I'm actually in a really happy place while I'm writing this stuff.
yeah.
And you're finding it really and actually that was the big thing with all of Dryad's Crown. The biggest discovery was that Silbury's daughter became a main character. I
Oh, interesting. Okay. All
I
right.
originally it just came out of necessity because I'm telling the story of Silbury and her husband in book 1. Her husband is murdered in Penderin away from her. And I'm like, well, Silbury's a point of view character. And how am I going to tell this story with her not there? So I'm like,
Hmm.
well, I guess I need to include Gideon as a point of view character. And then all of a sudden I find out that, oh my, wow, Gideon has this really interesting life of her own. And that character begins to grow a little bit more until, as I'm writing, it's almost 50-50 between the two,
Yeah. Yeah.
which,
And
yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
which I was going to say, it makes for an interesting moment because I can tell Silbury's perspective on something, and then I layer on Geedon's perspective, and she has different eyes, different outlook, and then all of a sudden there's something else. So some of the major story beats have stayed the same,
Mhm.
but I find that as I'm writing, I'm going, oh, okay, in order to get to where I need to get, something happens, and I'm like, okay, I don't think, particularly when you're doing like big battle sequences in fiction, you're like, okay, what have I not seen before that I would like to try? And then that leads to an interesting place where you're like, okay, this is going to be pretty crazy because I haven't read this, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's new to me. And then all of a sudden I'm kind of excited to see where it goes as well.
Yeah, it's that's so interesting to hear. It's like I had a professor in grad school. I was taking a book arts class, and I remember I had an idea to do something, and I said to her, oh, I'm worried this has been done before, and she just kind of looked me straight in the eye and said, "But you haven't done it,
Yeah.
right?" And so it is that sort of thing where if it's something that you as a creator haven't explored before, sure, you might be pulling from the zeitgeist to a certain degree, but the 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 nitty gritty, the particularities of creating that haven't been done. So I guess that's what we can look forward to in the next book. Then is this like David Hopkins' version of a big fantasy battle?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I've been doing my research. I've even got my book here. Let me grab it. This has been my Bible for the past month or so. It's
Oh, that's awesome.
battles. And I should say that, I mean, the Dryad's Crown is not medieval. I mean, because they're not set in Europe. It's not during the time period. It's a different world,
Yeah.
but all the technology, the feeling of it, so much of it is informed by medieval culture of that time
Mm.
that whenever I get stumped, I have to turn back to this and go, okay, what would have looked like? What would be the concerns and the thing? And one of the things that I'm really working through, and I don't think this is a spoiler for book 4, is how are battles fought when the soldiers don't want to die? Because,
Oh,
because
oh, that's interesting. Okay.
well, because you've seen Game of Thrones and you've seen all of these epic battles in fantasy where the humans are just running into battle. They're just, and you're like, I don't, they've got more courage than I do. Cause like,
Right.
and when you do a lot of research, with this stuff, and one of the things you find out is that very rarely, if ever, were people just charging into battle. They might run up to the front and then kind of stop, and then they're all kind of like, holding them at a distance, and it's a little bit of a dance back and forth because yeah, they want to live, and they're not crazy, but they're fighting against these bloodthirsty gnolls. And so what we're going to find is the gnolls are crazy, like they are savage, feral, monstrous creatures that are just going to come at them. But they don't know how to handle this. And so what's going to become is it's not only a battle of this army versus this army, it's also a battle of the people in charge of the army trying to figure out how to how to survive it because no one wants to be there.
So is that and I'm gonna draw this out so you can take a drink. Is
Thank you.
that a facet of characterization as a writer, or perhaps or is it a facet of world building, right? Like how much of that is the culture of Usul, sorry, and this portion of that world where I think of the ancient Romans where um, dying in battle was seen as to some degree a glorious act, right? And if you survived, your recompense was you got to retire and given a plot of land and become a farmer, even though few of the to be farmers. So it's like,
Yeah.
how much of this is the world building and the culture of what you've created?
I think it's actually almost primarily world building
Hmm.
because the story opens up at the very end of this very bloody battle, the War of the Hounds. And that was their grandfather's war. That was their, that was a different time. And that was when the stakes were high and heroes were heroes. It's been a relatively peaceful period. And so these are people who, yes, they are trained in combat theory, but they're not trained in confronting their own mortality. And so that becomes an issue where they're like, whoa, like, and also the other issue is for people who've read book three, Bren Caius has died.
Hmm.
Bren Caius was their rallying point. She was the person who everyone had faith in. With her not there, no one else can quite, rally them like she did. And so that becomes one of the consequences. And of course, what it does then is it creates a character moment for Silbury to sort of figure out how she's going to manage this situation. And inevitably, so much of the story, I'm really trying to explore, how do you tell a story that isn't just about beating the boss at the last level?
Right.
How do you not fall into that sort of video game mentality of storytelling? And part of it is I'm kind of putting the boss fight in the middle of the story, and then the later books of Ephraim, or sorry, the Dryad's Crown, actually take a very different tonal shift and kind of go in a different direction. It's all one story, but it's not going to be, I mean, it's not going to be as violent. It's going to be a different sort of issue that they're going to have to overcome. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what I'm dealing with right now is, we're right in the middle of it. And how is Silbury going to adjust to this? Because she's grown up knowing violence.
Yeah.
And this is a different type of violence. And so she's really trying to understand where she fits in all of this. Yeah.
It was so fascinating because you said earlier about how in writing the book so far, Silbury's children, especially her daughter, became
Yeah.
more and more of a focus. And I was really taken in book three about how you have this very interesting I can't think of the right word. It's not like a parallelism. It's almost more of a like a triad, for less lack of a better term, between Silbury as a mother,
Mm.
Brinchias as a maternal figure, but
Mhm.
then the way that Brinchias reacts to Silbury's daughter, right? Which is very, it's very back and forth. It's like very non-maternal and then an attempt to be maternal. And it just, I found that whole relationship really fascinating. I don't know. Could you like, did that was that planned from the beginning, or did that just come about through the course of writing?
Uh, People aren't going to believe me, but yeah, it was planned.
Oh,
uh,
excellent. No, that's
yeah,
great. Okay.
yeah, no, it's that whole dynamic of the mother, maiden, crone.
Mm,
You know,
okay. Yep.
when you're dealing, particularly when you're writing sort of mythic female characters, that mother, maiden, crone dynamic follows through. And so Bren is older. She is the crone essentially, and
Right.
then we've got Silbury as the mother, and then Gideon as the young maiden. And the other thing is just exploring motherhood, because Silbury has really struggled with her own abilities as a mom. She's not as affectionate, she's not as loving. She, it was always her husband that was in charge of all the sappy stuff. She was there, you know, really trying to kind of figure herself out. And maybe it was part of her upbringing. Maybe it was also just part of who she is, how she's wired. Um,
Right.
but with Bren, we actually see that she may not even really want to have been a mother. We know that she was a mother to Mendel, her son who tries to kill her.
Right.
And um, but yeah, you get the sense that because she's in a the word trouble is weird, but it is, she's she's in a triad of a marriage, and you do get the sense from reading the book that the other two parents were more the parents.
Right.
She was busy. She was the one having to run, Northeast Amen, and she was the one being the high general, and she didn't have time for him. And even, we don't really explore that relationship. I kind of leave it up to the reader to figure out what that relationship was like, but toxic may not be an understatement. And this idea that Bren overcompensates with Gideon, being cold and mean, and then all of a sudden, like, I commissioned a play for you. Like, you get the sense that maybe that's how Bren dealt with her own son.
Yeah.
Like,
Uh,
I don't know what to do here. Here's a
I'm gonna,
horse.
I'm gonna dedicate this next hour to focusing on you,
Yeah.
and it's gonna go very extreme. Yeah. Um,
I built a statue in your honor at the edge of the city.
it's just,
Whatever.
yeah, it's so fascinating because I really liked there is that sense with Brett of the like the negligent parent who is overcompensating in this one moment of time, um it came across really, really, I don't know, I was just sort of fascinated by it. So
Yeah. And I mean,
uh,
the whole series is about motherhood,
mm,
which as a father sounds like a weird thing to pursue. But, the opening line of book one is about a mother waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of a child's cries, which to me, what is more motherly than waking up in the middle of the night when your kid's crying? And,
right.
so, we explore it through the eyes of Silbury. We see it a little bit in Bren. We see kind of surrogate parents in Dahlia and Maricel to an extent. We do see Timon as kind of a father figure. Um,
Hmm.
so we do get him, but for the most part, it's a lot of relationships revolving around that concept of motherhood. And the one thing that I wanted to do was to not idealize it so much. I think that there's sometimes a problem when men try to write women, they will go either to one extreme or the other. They will either idealize women as, the um, the tough paragon of virtue who just is going to kick everyone's ass, and then we go the other extreme, where you almost wonder if the writer even likes women. Uh, and I was really trying to create these flawed characters who are still trying to figure out things themselves. One of the things I hope that people pick up while they're reading it is to go, oh, these people don't know what they're doing all the time.
Right.
Like they're figuring it out as they go, because that to me seems like the most honest assessment of parenting is you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I hope
Right.
I hope they turn out okay.
Well, and it seems to break as well with, I think, a lot of conventions of fantasy, which is that even if you have the like chosen farmhand who's going to become, the hero of whatever, they always seem to know what to do. And having characters who make mistakes, who don't know, as a reader is really compelling, right? It feels like you're reading real characters in an uncertain world rather than plot points in a nicely constructed world.
Yeah. And that's tricky because I know where the character's going and they have to go there because that's where I want them to go. But it's hard because you're trying to create the contrivance of choice. You're trying to make it look like, oh, this was an actual decision that was being made and considered, and they're not quite sure. And I will say that this is one area where I'm very thankful for the editors on my book series. I'm very fortunate. A lot of indie writers go it alone, which, people may chastise them, but let's be honest, we don't always have the luxury of having editors
Right.
if you're not traditionally published. I fortunately have been able to have an editor where I have my wife who she beta reads everything that I write, and she gives me very honest feedback. I have an amazing developmental editor in Holly Walrath, and then I have a proofreader in Kara Robinson. And you'll notice that they're all women,
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
and in part it's because my main characters are women, and so
Yep.
I need them to read through it and be like, yeah, this doesn't feel right. This
Yeah.
feels off. Um, and fortunately, I haven't been dinged too much in that area. Um, the funny thing though is, and this is true, um, Holly, who is an amazing editor, I can't speak highly enough about her. She has actually pushed me a lot more to make the story more violent because
Interesting.
I tend to want to turn the camera away.
Sort of like a Hitchcockian thing. You want
Yeah,
to imply rather than show.
yeah. And
Yeah.
she's like, this guy just beheaded her with her own sword. You really need to show that. I'm like, do I have to? She's like, yeah. I'm like, okay.
Well, so the other aspect of what you're saying earlier as well about like the suggestion of kind of inorganic sense of development and choice makes me think, and I will lay my cards on the table of playing games that you've run.
Mhm.
So, is there a relationship to GMing, right? To this idea of this is the overarching story I want to tell, but I don't want to make it seem like I'm steamrolling you all.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought that up because I was like, man, Josh is going to ask about Dungeons and Dragons. I got to be ready.
Of course I am.
And it's difficult because a good GM is also a good storyteller,
Right,
but sometimes a good storyteller is not a good GM
right, yeah, yeah.
because sometimes you so want to tell this story, but the roles don't go that way or the characters don't want to do that. And you find yourself, as you said, kind of railroading them that way,
Yeah.
which I have to do that in my books because they're not going to do anything unless I unless I put the words on the page. So I would say in some ways um, there is not a connection there, but it can also be a little bit of a challenge because you have to remind yourself that in stories, characters don't have hit points and they don't take turns while fighting.
Right.
It's not a turn-based combat situation. Um, one good hit can kind of end the fight, no matter how tough they are. And there's just all sorts of dynamics. There's no big boss at the end of the level, and so I know that telling those kind of stories that play heavily on game mechanics is quite popular right now. But I don't want to do that kind of stuff where it feels like video game or D&D. And so in some ways, I had to sort of when I started writing it, I had to be very aware of the fact I was like, okay, don't make this a D&D adventure. Don't make this feel like D&D. Um, but I will say that when the battles get really complicated,
Hmm.
some of that uh, RPG mentality actually really helps because you are able to describe the action and kind of focus in on one thing. I don't have to say what's going on all around them. The
Hmm.
reader's going to do that for me. I can just kind of set the scene and focus in on some certain key dynamics of the fight, and that will kind of be sufficient. And being a AGM actually has helped with that because you do learn a little bit of the language of fight choreography as you're kind of walking people through encounters.
Right, right.
So that
It
helps.
it does. I brought it up partly because, in the past I've often heard writers talk about how, I had this novel planned out, but as I got further and further into the mentality of the character, I realized what I had planned was not what the character would do.
Mhm.
And so that's partly the reason I brought it up is because I feel like when you're playing a role-playing game, what the players do can sometimes go counter to what the GM quote unquote intends,
Yeah.
but it leads the overarching story into a realm nobody expected.
Yeah.
And I've always been fascinated by writers who describe that phenomena as well when they're 1,000% in control of the story, right? Like
Yeah.
they hit a point where they're just like, this character I've been writing wouldn't do what I wanted them to do. Have you encountered that at all in working on the Dryad's Crown, or?
Little bit. I think that one of the things you talked about is, it is one of the great functions of storytelling is you set up a personality trait.
Mm,
This character is decisive. Well, what you immediately want to do is throw them in a situation where they have to be indecisive or where being decisive would actually be a hindrance. Or, you create a character who is very stodgy and stuffy,
yeah.
and then you create a story that kind of forces them to loosen up a bit. Or you take a kid who's very immature and then they have to grow up during the course of the story or whatever it is. And so in some ways, it's actually a good thing when you're writing and the characters surprise you because you're like, oh, that's growth. that's
Mhm.
that's what we want to have happen. For me, one of the big challenges was, um, and this is going to sound odd, but did you ever see Queen's Gambit?
I keep meaning to. I
Okay.
haven't yet. It's in my queue.
As I was watching Queen's Gambit, I was like, wow, this is Silbury, like the main character.
Oh, okay.
Not how much she looks, not so much how she looked, but how she acted. Like I don't actually see that actress as being, I'm not fan casting that actress as Silbury, but it's more this idea that she is, when you watch Queen's Gambit, you see a introvert that is taking in their surroundings, is thinking, is emotionally withdrawn. Um, might even be, a little bit. She has difficulty reading people, their gestures, their intentions, all of that. And at the very end of Queen's Gambit, spoiler alert, at the very end, there's a moment where she finally breaks down and cries.
Mm,
And I was like, that's what I want for Silbury, is I want her to be just, not emotional. And then I want to give her just one moment at the end of book one where she does break down.
yeah.
But then I have to remind myself, because that's only book one of nine, I can't keep doing that every book.
Right, right.
It's like Wolverine, who's supposed to be a loner, and yet he hangs out with everyone in the Marvel universe and adopts like these sort of surrogate children everywhere he goes. Like Wolverine is like the world's worst loner in that,
Right.
like, I'm sorry, Wolverine, you're not a loner. You
I
are the
mean,
exact opposite.
when he's Ms. Marvel's like mentor, I'm all in, but
Yeah.
B, yeah, he's definitely not a loner at that point.
Yeah. So if I'm trying to write Silbury as this sort of emotionally, I don't want to say stunted because that implies
Yeah, I
value.
know. Right,
Um,
yeah,
but she is emotionally withdrawn. She's not,
yeah.
Maricel is very emotional. She keeps her feelings on her sleeve. She feels things very strongly. And Silbury is not like that. She's processing. And so I can't have those kind of moments every time. And so you really, if anything, you could sometimes wish that your characters would do things that's unexpected, but they have to feel earned. And so you're sort of, it's like you only get so many chips and you can't play them all the time. Otherwise, people are like, well, that's not the character at all. Like that's not who it is. You just keep saying that. but it's not true. And the other thing that I run into with characters doing things that I don't expect them to do is that Gideon, and I find a lot of writers do this, and I'm falling into the same trap. Gideon is a young girl. I never say her age, but I do mention her teeth are had fallen out as a way to kind of imply age.
Okay.
So, she's at that age where your front teeth are missing. So I'll let parents, you guys, you'll figure that out.
I'm
But
trying. I'm trying to remember,
it's
frankly,
it's been
but
a while.
it's been so long. Yeah,
But it's young. It's really, really young.
it is. It is. Yeah. I mean, it's what it would be between like 5 and 8 or 9. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
big span. So
Yeah. But here's the thing, like she is constantly saying some of the most mature things
yes,
in the book. And
yes.
writers do that so much where they age up their younger characters. It's like people get impatient with young characters. And so they're like, oh gosh, I need to like all of a sudden they're the ones spouting all the wisdom. And that's what I'm running into with book 4 is at times she's just really like giving it to the adults who should be the ones that have all the wisdom, and she's the one spouting all the insight. And so you try to kind of backtrack that and show it as growth, as maturity, but it's tricky. These characters, they kind of fly in directions you don't always want them to go. And it like D&D, you're like, well, is this what the character would do? Can they actually roll that? I don't know.
A nat 20 on wisdom. What?
Yeah. Wow,
Um,
she's just hitting, and so, but I
but,
do
but
find, oh, sorry.
oh no, 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 go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I was going to say with younger characters, that was the value of having Yurig there because
Yeah.
her brother stays young.
Right.
And so the brother in many ways becomes the way to remind you of how young they are, while I kind of let Gideon fly all over the place. But now with Yurig sort of out of the story, she's a little bit squirrelier.
That's interesting. I wondered about that because in book 2 in particular, they feel very much like a Holmes Watson kind of thing, right? Like
Yes.
Yurig is there to constantly be the we are children
Yeah.
reminder. But having said that, I will just say again, as a reader, I was never bothered by her actions because I felt like a child her age, as mercurial as it may be, having gone through the trauma that she's gone through,
Yeah.
would have a little more insight into the world, right? And that was something I found really interesting in book 3 is when she runs back to Marisol,
Yeah.
seeing the way that she remembers Marisol versus the way that Sylvia remembers Marisol, and that it reminds me a lot. It's just such a weird comparison. It reminds me a lot of the very early Neil Gaiman, Dave McKean graphic novel, Mr. Punch, that is built around the idea of how a child sees adult interactions. And I got a lot of that in both book 2 and book 3. Just this idea of we're seeing the same situation through two very different world experiences.
Yeah. And I firmly believe that children are great observers of their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many ways, having Gideon there allows me to better tell Silbury's story. It doesn't
Right.
necessarily work the other way though.
Oh, really? Why? I'm curious.
I don't know because I think Silbury's looking elsewhere.
Okay.
I think she's figuring out herself. She's grieving the loss of her husband. I have to keep reminding myself that her husband died like 3 months ago. Um, so she's still very much like processing, like, here's this woman that loves me. My husband just died, so I don't really know if I'm ready for that.
Right.
Um, I've got these powers that I don't quite know what's going on there. I'm learning all this weird stuff about my life. So she's not watching Gideon. In fact, one of the big jokes is in every book, Silbury never seems to know where her kids are. Like,
Not at all. I mean, she feels good that her son's at the magic school. She's like, all right, that's done.
Yeah,
Like I can wipe my hands of that. So
yeah. And you notice how desperate she is to get the other one there.
right.
She's
Yeah.
like, if they're there, I know that someone is caring for them.
Well, and so I assume Urig's connection with the book that they found will come back. Again, super spoiler territory,
Yeah.
but
Um, I will say this, and I think it's light spoilers.
okay.
So people, if they really don't want any spoilers, you can maybe skip ahead 3 minutes or so.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Um, but I will say this, Yurig and the book do come into play later, but it's much later.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
And
So not in book 4 is what you're saying, like further books down the road.
yeah, and
Okay.
that's one of the things that I'm actually a little bit happy with is for readers who actually read the whole thing, they're going to go, oh, there was this thing that you mentioned in book 2 that didn't come out until book 9. And, you know, they were, oh, you were mentioning this, and you actually did have, so because that's one of the things you do when you're outlining is you're going, okay, I'm going to say this, and I hope that people forget about it because it's going to come up later, and they'll go, oh yeah, that's a thing. But if you look at the whole series when it's done, will be about 700 pages.
Okay. All right.
Which, I mean, I've read Moby
It's
Dick, which is 700 pages or so.
it's
I
a Neil
remember,
Stevenson novel. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
I remember what happened in the first chapter, even though I'm not like so. So I feel okay dropping stuff in there and being like,
Yeah.
we're going to leave this for a while and we'll come back to it much later.
Well, this is perhaps a leading question, and it gets into, I think, both of our experiences in the comic world as well.
Yeah.
But there is the difference between a serialized storytelling and a collected storytelling.
Yeah.
And these are effectively serialized, right? I mean, you're telling novellas in moments over a period of time. So do you have concerns that if you reference something in book 1 or 2 that comes back to play in book 8 or 9, the reader's really going to have to remember that or not?
I'm less worried about it the further on I go.
Oh, okay. All right.
Because effectively books 1 and 2 could be standalone. I actually think
Right.
that you could read book 2 without having read any of the other series, and I think it would read just fine by itself.
As a reader, I would totally agree with that. You could start with book 2, and it recounts enough of, I would say it recounts the narrative part of book 1, not the emotional part of book 1. But you can't read 3 without reading 2. I mean, that's just impossible. So,
well, and I was going to say, it becomes the further you go in the story, the more you need the previous books.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
okay.
By the time I just, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just can't imagine anyone jumping into 8 without having read 1 through 7.
Like, right. That makes no sense then.
So,
But the hurdle here to me seems far less because each book is a novella than like reading whatever volume Game of Thrones is on when he releases the next book, because you have how many thousands of pages to read to catch up,
I worry even about the editors just being able to keep track of things.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I'm writing novellas and I have notes on, okay, this character's name is this, and I say that this happened, so I need to I worry about missing things. I cannot imagine, whether you're talking about, Wheel of Time or Stormlight Archive or Game of Thrones, like how there's got to be details in there that just get missed. That those editors, I mean, that's a lot of work there. I mean, just to keep track of the continuity that's going on in the stories. I can't even imagine.
I mean, this is such a nerdy insider question. Do fantasy series have like a continuity editor like films do? I mean, does that exist?
I would guess that the more popular the series is, the more necessary it is.
Okay.
That's just what I would guess. I mean, there's no way that Tolkien had that back when he wrote like Lord of the Rings. That didn't exist. But I would imagine that Brandon Sanderson with Stormlight Archive and Mistborn, I imagine that he has people that their whole job is just keeping up with the wiki.
Wow.
You
It's
know,
just it's just mind-boggling to think
yeah.
about because yeah, there is so much that happens in any fantasy series, yours, others, what have you. So
Well, and you even think about with what I'm writing right now. I think we're 4 books in. I mean, I'm writing book 4 right now. I think we have about 50 named characters in the story.
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That's that's a lot of characters to keep track of. And some of the names people aren't going to remember. Like Jory is the name of the mother in the very opening scene. I don't think anyone's going to remember Jory because I say her name once, she's there for about a page, and then we move on. But I hope that people remember who Maricel is, you know,
Right. Right.
or
Exactly. Yeah.
or Dahlia Tulane, or and even so some of those characters I think are more important. But yeah, keeping track of all those can be really tricky. I even had this issue where when I first wrote book 1, there were 2 parents. It was Jory and Ethan. And I removed the dad because I was like, the dad's not doing anything. And it's just, I mean,
He's your Joseph.
yeah,
It's like, oh, Mary's doing all this stuff. Just Joseph's a carpenter. We're done. We're done. Move on.
yeah. And so I was like, there's really no reason. And in part, it kind of messes with the theme of motherhood if I just throw Ethan in there and what's Ethan
Right.
doing.
Yeah.
But here's the thing is you write that and then you forget about it. And then, all of a sudden Ethan comes along in book 6. People are like, who's Ethan? You're like, oh, I
well,
forgot. I forgot.
well, so this is a very like inside baseball question, but like, what tools do you use to keep track of all this stuff?
Um, Before I just used like Microsoft Word and I just kind of kept my notes down. Now I use Scrivener.
Okay.
And yes, this is my sales pitch. I love Scrivener. It is so great for particularly for people that need to keep notes about their setting, about the map, about the world. I have to at least once a day I have to look up something about the 12 gods, the 12 named gods, to be like, okay, Yoon is about this, and then Wedril does this, and then what were the 3 gods of life again? And so, but Scrivener, I've got all of it in there. And so instead of having to open up like 4 or 5 different programs, I have it all in there, and I have my outline in there, and I keep everything organized that way. And I don't know if it's made me write faster, but it has prevented things like Ethan showing up out of nowhere because I'm able to. I actually have a search feature where I can type in the search bar and it'll search all the books for me.
Oh wow, that's cool.
So I could type in Ethan and be like, oh, when did I last mention him? I'm like, oh, I didn't mention him at all. He doesn't exist. He's not a character. Uh,
he's just like a ghost in your like Scrivener
yeah,
file somewhere. So
but it's helpful because if I type in Marisol, I can actually check and say, okay, this is where we left her last,
that
and I can go back to it.
that is handy. That
Yeah,
sounds very, very handy.
yeah. I'm amazed by how people like Herman Melville were able to just write with pen and paper, and I'm like, you just wrote like
I feel like I know nothing about Melville, but I just suspect he had to have had like some sort of like crazy cataloging system,
note
like
cards everywhere.
yeah,
Yeah,
like tabs, and like he bought like an old library catalog card. I don't even know if Dewey Decimal would come out yet, but
yeah.
just I mean, yeah, because it's so complex when you see that. Or even Tolkien, like
Mhm.
I've never read all of the Lord of the Rings because I can't get past the
We've talked
200
about
pages
this.
in the Shire. Yeah, I can't get through it. But I feel like he had to have had some sort of cataloging system I mean, because he
Yeah,
invented that language, right? He was a linguist. Like that's what was interesting to him, and everything else kind of grew around it.
yeah.
So
Well, Yeah, and even things like I've got to be writing. I'm like, okay, how many years ago was the War of the Hounds? Like, when did
Yeah.
that begin? When did it end? How old is, and I really try to stay away from ages, because I don't want to mention how old people are, because that locks me in to a certain timeline that now I'm like, okay, well, could this have happened if, because that would have meant she was like 12 when she, but and so I try to stay away from that just for my own sanity.
That is interesting because it makes me think as well. Does that make it feel more like a fantasy realm?
Yeah.
Or like I think like back to like the early Middle Ages where only the clergy were the timekeepers. So
Yeah.
your average person wouldn't know what the year was. They would know the passage of the seasons.
Yeah.
Um, and considering, and if I'm using this word or this term incorrectly or inappropriately, correct me, but because I feel like your setting is a very low magic setting,
Yep.
um, when you say like you can pull out a book on like medieval warfare to do research, it makes sense because you don't have like every side has mages casting enormous fireballs to destroy the enemy. It is all very magic is very scarce.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's why I even talk about the war mage. Like,
Right.
each side probably had one, if any.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
had one, and they serve very specific functions. You may not put them at the front of the battle because you kind of want to keep them around. They're not going to be at the vanguard because, like, we need them, or
Yeah.
her.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so the magic is so scarce and so precious that, yeah, it doesn't factor in as much. But even what you talked about with the medieval age, like, they would know if someone was an adult, but they may not be like, I'm 32 and 3 months old. Like, the timekeeping just wasn't as much. Not that it didn't exist, but it just wasn't something that was fixated on.
Right. Like you like again, I go back to I think of the passage of time is really predicated around seasons,
Yeah.
right? I'm 24 summers old, like you can quantify that, but that's it. So
Yeah,
uh,
and even like ever since I was old enough to do this task on the farm, we talked about the maturity of Gideon, and that was one thing that I was very intentional about, is to understand that, Gideon from a very young age was working in a field. She was tending sheep. She was working the field because that's what you did with children, you put them to work. And so she has a different mentality than, say, a kid that would grow up in our world, because there's just a different perspective. There isn't like, I'm going to wake up from my nap and have 30 minutes of cartoons and a snack. It's, dad needs me out in the field and I am really tired, but child labor laws don't exist. So I'm just going to kind of roll with it because I don't know. And and it might even be shocking how young some of the characters are when they got married. Like, I never
right.
mentioned how old Silbury was when she married Callus, but I will say this: they probably weren't like there probably weren't laws that were like governing that kind of thing. It was, she was of a marriageable age, and so was he, and so they did. Um, but yeah, I don't want to deal with that. But Tolkien, this thing, I love Tolkien, but he will actually mention like dates on a Gregorian calendar in Middle Earth. So it'll be like March 30th. And I'm like, oh gosh, why are you naming the year? Because now fans can go, okay, it took them 12 days to get across, 1,000 miles, and they'll be able to do the math.
Right.
And I'm
Right.
like, I don't want to give anyone a date because they're going to be like, well, they don't line up, so yeah,
There
there's
there
enough things to worry about.
there is something about vagary that makes a fantasy world feel more real,
Yeah.
right? You don't want these definable metrics to be able to look at and go, oh well, I can now calculate this, this, and this. And I'll be honest, I hadn't realized you hadn't given any specific ages because I've read the first three books, like at all. Um, the characters felt, I guess, in my head, the age that they're supposed to be, which is fine, I think, from an audience perspective. Um, but it doesn't give me a number to like hone in on, and like focus on, which is great, I think. So,
Well, and I think that the reader is going to imagine the character how they want to imagine them anyways.
yeah.
So why fight that? You know, in my head, Bren is old enough to be Silbury's mom.
I definitely got that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not something that I really call out, which means that Mendel and Silbury are about the same age. But yeah, I don't really focus on it because it's not that important. But I will say, writing Bren, um, having an editor, we actually did decide Bren was going to factor into the series a lot more in a later book. We were going to do this extended flashback and stuff. We're
Oh,
taking all of that out, and I think at some point in the future, I might do a standalone Bren book.
oh, I love it. That'd be awesome.
But part of it is because of all the characters I write, I just love, she is in some ways the most responsible hot mess in my stories. Like, she has clearly got the weight of the world on her shoulders, and yet she is also like a complete train wreck in different ways. So I mixed metaphor, hot mess, train wreck. She's both. But yeah, so I'm really excited to write what Bren in her younger years was like.
That sounds phenomenal. Count me on board to read that as soon as you write it. So,
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, but I think time-wise, we've probably reached our hour here.
oh yeah.
Anything else you wanted to get to before we call it a day?
Um, no, I guess just apart from I'm super excited about book 4, which
Thank
is
you.
out when?
Well, okay, let's say
Damn it, I shouldn't have asked.
don't put dates on anything. No, right now, I will say this, we are totally on schedule,
Okay.
but right now we're looking at maybe mid-October.
Okay. All
Um,
right.
but what I'm doing, and this is the great thing about being an indie writer, is that no one's really tapping their watch
Yep.
going, come on, I've been waiting 3, 4 months for this book to come out. And where is it? What will happen is when it comes out, people will forget how long they waited for it. They'll be reading other
Oh, right.
things.
Yeah.
And then when the whole thing's out, it won't matter. But the one thing is since I'm working with an illustrator, I'm working with multiple editors, proofreaders. I don't want to get in a situation where, because they're at the end of the assembly line, they're supposed to like move it, and like I've been taking my sweet time, and now they have to rush because we got to hit a deadline.
Right.
So ultimately, I have my own personal deadlines, which usually fall on like daily word counts. I need to write this many words a day. But when I hand it off to Holly, when I hand it off to Daniel or whoever I'm working with, it's usually, hey, take as much time as you need and thank you. And then we'll set that date. But right now we're on track. Book 4 will be out probably mid-October. And then between book 4 and 5, there will be a little bit of a longer break because I'm writing a little short story in between those two that I'm going to try to get published. So we'll take a break. And so it may be, whereas every book has come out about every 3 months,
Okay.
the next book will probably be about 4 to 5 months. Um, but I should be done with the whole thing by the end of 2022 or at the very beginning of 2023.
Oh, okay.
So,
All right.
so yeah,
I
and
mean,
then
because I mean, after book 4 will be at the halfway point effectively, right?
yeah,
I mean, it's 9 books. There's not a clear half point, but
yeah, yeah, things are going to get interesting because yeah, as we continue on, like it's funny, as you're writing it, the outline becomes less and less stringent because you're kind of just going with it.
right.
You've internalized the story so much. I had a moment probably about 2 weeks ago where I was just I don't know, I think I was like having coffee or something, and all of a sudden I was like, oh, I know the last scene of the book of the series.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and I was like, cool, okay, let me write that down. And you write it down, you're like, oh, that's it. And but here's the thing is like I didn't know that when I started it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But, and what happens is you get more and more of these moments and they don't always come in the right order. So you write them down, and yeah, so you kind of find that as you're writing, you become a lot more intuitive as you keep going. And that's a good thing. So hopefully by the time I get to the end of it, I'm thinking those deadlines are gonna, I'm gonna just be like automatic. That's the hope. Um, because I kind of at that point I'm like I know the story, and then you have to let it go, and then you move on to the next one. So
Well, that's awesome. I know I, for one, am really looking forward to the next book and
oh, thank you.
all of the remaining books. Like, uh, two, like one was great. Two really grabbed me. Three, I could barely put down. Like,
I
I just blew through three. I mean, like, I think like in a night and a half, really quickly. So,
I know that I'm not supposed to have favorites, but I would agree with you on that. I think but here's the thing is, and 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 not to remove the magic behind it, but three had Holly Walrath as an editor on it.
makes sense. Totally
I
makes sense. Yeah.
I did not have Holly to help me through book two or book one, and she has been really instrumental in doing the kind of edits that I need. Like I
Mm.
really don't need line editors. I mean, maybe someone would read my stuff and say that I do, but the kind of editing that I want is like big picture.
Right. Okay.
And and
So
she'll
scope rather
yeah,
than like minutia. Yeah.
yeah. Because telling me to not start a sentence with a conjunction, I'm like, yeah, okay, fine, fine. But
That's on video now. I just want to
yeah,
point out.
but telling me like I don't believe this character's arc, like we need to sell it more because you just kind of that really forces me to go back and look at the story and rethink it. And part of what I'm doing, this is working with her is my MFA. It's my writer's workshop, because working with her, I'm learning so much, and I'm really growing, in part because I have someone who's not afraid to kind of challenge me on things and say, maybe you should show the decapitation. Like, I don't want to. Like, you should show it. But, and so it's things like that that's making it stronger. And so I'm guessing that from three on, it will have a different feel just because there's another person looking over my shoulder.
Well, I would say, and this is anecdotal, but just as a reader, to both your and Holly's credit, it didn't feel like a jarring shift
Yeah.
when she came on board in three. One, two, and three to me all felt very organic in terms of their development and where the story was progressing. Which as a reader I love, because it feels like that to me is part of the journey rather than something has happened behind the scenes. I never had that impression,
That's
right?
good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as I said, and I think four and five, I think, are very much, sort of a breaking point of a lot of things that have been alluded to.
Mm-hmm.
And then after five, um, the rest of the series kind of takes a different feel. That'll be really, I think, um, that'll be the make or break point in the book. Is
Okay.
can I move people from this to this in a way that feels honest and feels enjoyable and good? Because that's one of those things where um, with a story, particularly like a long story, is there are going to be changes, but then there's also going to be like major transitions and turning points. And if you can keep the audience in for the ride, then I think you've got yourself a story there. But that's going to be the real challenge, I think, for this series, and I'm looking forward to it.
Well, as a reader, I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to talk about something that's been sitting in my head for a good year plus.
Of
Appreciate it.
course. Anytime, anytime. I love being a sounding board.